When I got home from 5-day work conference, I honestly thought I had pulled into the wrong driveway. My old stone boundary wall, the one that had been standing there since before I graduated high school, was gone, and in its place sat a brand new wooden fence that had somehow managed to steal almost 4 feet of my backyard. The craziest part wasn't that someone had done it while I was gone. The craziest part was that my neighbor actually believed I'd shrug, unpack my suitcase, and live with it like nothing had happened. Looking back now, I realized that whole mess didn't begin with a fence. It started with pride, the kind that convinces a man he's always the smartest person in the room. I bought my house just outside Franklin, Tennessee, in the spring of 2020. It wasn't flashy, and that was exactly why I loved it. The neighborhood had mature maple trees that shaded the streets all summer, brick homes that had been cared for instead of flipped, and neighbors who still wave from their porches without expecting anything in return. My lot backed up against a small creek, and along the eastern edge ran an old stacked fieldstone wall. It wasn't very tall, maybe knee-high, but every stone had been placed there decades earlier by hand. Time had rounded the edges, moss grew between the cracks, and every autumn little squirrels would hop along it like it had always belonged there. There was something comforting about that wall. It made the property feel settled, like generations had already approved of the place before I ever arrived. The family next door moved in about 6 months after I did. Their names were Derek and Allison Mercer. Allison was polite enough whenever we crossed paths, but Derek had a personality that filled every available inch of space. He wasn't openly rude. He just had this constant need to prove that everything he owned was newer, bigger, smarter, or more expensive than everyone else's. If he bought a truck, he'd explain the towing capacity before you even asked. If he installed outdoor lighting, he'd spend 20 minutes describing the imported fixtures. One Saturday afternoon, he practically cornered me while I was mowing the lawn just to show me a pizza oven he'd imported from Italy. I remember smiling through the conversation while thinking, buddy, it's still just pizza. Still, we got along well enough. We'd exchange a wave, complain about the weather, maybe chat for 5 minutes before heading back inside. Nothing suggested we'd eventually end up staring at each other across a courtroom. Everything changed 2 summers later when Derek announced he was building what he proudly called the ultimate backyard retreat. According to him, it wasn't just going to be a swimming pool. It was going to be an experience. There would be an oversized pool with a tanning shelf, an outdoor kitchen, a covered pavilion with televisions, built-in speakers hidden among landscaping, decorative retaining walls, and enough concrete to make the backyard look more like a luxury resort than a suburban home. Every time I saw him outside, he'd have another set of blueprints rolled under one arm, talking with the excitement of someone planning a private country club. I nodded, wished him luck, and figured it wasn't really my business. Construction started in early June. Dump trucks rolled through the neighborhood every morning. Excavators carved giant holes into the yard, and workers hauled stacks of lumber, pipe, and rebar across the property. It was noisy, but temporary. Then my company sent me to Denver for a leadership conference. 5 days. Leave Monday morning, come back Saturday afternoon. Before I locked my front door, I glanced across the property line without thinking much about it. The old stone wall stood exactly where it always had, weathered, sturdy, and quiet beneath the shade trees. I had absolutely no reason to believe it wouldn't still be there when I came home. I couldn't have been more wrong. By the time I pulled into my driveway that Saturday afternoon, all I wanted was a shower, a real cup of coffee, and a full night's sleep in my own bed. The conference had been the usual mix of hotel meeting rooms, stale pastries, awkward networking dinners, and PowerPoint presentations that somehow lasted twice as long as they should have. Home sounded perfect, but the second I stepped out of my truck, something felt wrong. It wasn't obvious at first. The house looked exactly the same. The flower beds were where I'd left them. Even the wind chimes hanging on my porch were making that familiar soft clinking sound. Still, there was this strange feeling that my yard had somehow shrunk while I was gone. I grabbed my suitcase and started walking toward the backyard. About halfway down the side path, I stopped dead in my tracks. The stone wall was gone. Completely gone. In its place stood one of those cheap pressure-treated pine privacy fences, the kind contractors throw up in a day without giving much thought to how it'll look 5 years later. The fence stretched the entire length of the property, except it wasn't sitting where my wall had always been. It was several feet inside my yard. Fresh dirt covered the ground where the stones had once rested. Tire tracks crossed what used to be my grass, and piles of broken limestone were stacked near a dumpster park behind Derek's house like someone had demolished 40 years of history without giving it a second thought. I just stood there holding my suitcase, staring at the empty space where that wall had always been. At first, I honestly wondered if I was somehow missing something. Maybe construction equipment had temporarily moved part of it. Maybe they planned to rebuild it later. But the longer I looked, the more obvious the truth became. Somebody hadn't accidentally disturbed my property. Somebody had intentionally taken it. I left my luggage sitting beside the back porch and walked straight through the connecting gate between our yards. Derek was sitting under a patio umbrella with a glass of iced tea, while half a dozen contractors moved wheelbarrows around what looked like the future pool deck. He noticed me immediately and smiled like nothing unusual had happened. "Well, look who's back," he called. "How is Denver?" I didn't answer his question. I pointed toward the fence. "Where's my wall?" For just a split second, I saw something flash across his face. It wasn't guilt. It was annoyance, like I'd interrupted his afternoon. Then he shrugged. "Oh, that old thing," he said casually. "Yeah, we had to take it down." I blinked. "You had to take my wall down?" He stood up slowly, brushed some dust off his shorts, and walked over like we were discussing lawn fertilizer instead of missing property. "Technically," he said with a little grin, "it wasn't your wall." I laughed once, but there wasn't a single ounce of humor in it. "You want to explain that?" He pulled his phone from his pocket, opened a real estate app, and zoomed in on a satellite image of our neighborhood. Tiny white property lines floated across the screen. He tapped one of them confidently. "See? According to this, the actual property line is over here." His finger landed almost exactly where the new fence now stood. I looked from the screen to the fence and back again. "You're basing this on an app?" "It's updated all the time," he said. "These apps are pretty accurate now." "More accurate than the deed?" I asked. "More accurate than county records?" He shrugged again, that same shrug I'd later come to absolutely hate. "Old walls get built wrong all the time." My contractor agreed. I folded my arms. "Did you ever think about asking me before tearing it down?" "Honestly," he replied, "I figured you'd be happy once everything looked nicer." That sentence stayed with me for a long time. Not because it made sense, but because it told me exactly how his mind worked. He genuinely believed appearances mattered more than ownership. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Every document I signed when I bought this house shows that wall sitting on the property line. Derek smiled again. Paperwork isn't perfect. Behind him, workers continued setting wooden forms for a massive concrete patio. One of them drove stakes directly into the strip of land that, according to every legal document I'd ever seen, belonged to me. I pointed toward the construction. "You should stop before you make this worse." He looked over his shoulder and chuckled. "I've already spent close to 200 grand on this project. I'm not stopping because you're worried about a few feet of grass. It's not about grass." "Sure it is." "No," I said quietly, looking him straight in the eye. "It's about property." For the first time, his smile faded, just a little, but only for a second. "Then I guess somebody else can figure it out." He picked up his drink, turned around, and walked back toward the patio as if the conversation had ended. I stood there watching the workers continue building on land that wasn't theirs, and something inside me shifted. The anger didn't disappear. It became focused. There wasn't any point yelling anymore. Derek had already decided he was right. The only thing left was proving he wasn't. Early Monday morning, I drove to the county records office. It wasn't exactly an exciting place, just fluorescent lights, old filing cabinets, and clerks quietly helping people navigate paperwork that most folks never think about until something goes wrong. I explained what had happened and asked for a certified copy of the original subdivision plat connected to my deed. A woman disappeared into the records room for several minutes before returning with a large folded map stamped with the county seal. She spread it across the counter, and within seconds I found the line I'd been looking for. The measurements matched exactly where my stone wall had always stood. Not close, not approximately, exactly. I paid for certified copies and drove straight to a licensed surveying company. The surveyor assigned to my property was a man named Kyle Bennett. He looked like someone who'd spent most of his career outdoors, weathered skin, faded baseball cap, calm voice. When I explained the situation, he listened without interrupting. Once I finished, he glanced toward the fence and smiled politely. Well, he said, either somebody made an honest mistake, or somebody made a very expensive one. Watching Kyle work was strangely fascinating. He unloaded GPS equipment, tripods, measuring rods, and a metal detector from his truck. As he walked the property, he explained that subdivisions built decades earlier usually had iron survey pins buried beneath the soil at each corner. Grass grew over them. Dirt covered them. People forgot they existed, but the markers rarely moved. About 20 minutes later, his detector gave a sharp beep. He knelt, dug through several inches of dirt, brushed away the soil with his hand, and exposed a rusted iron rod. "There's your first corner," he said. A second marker appeared farther down the property. Then another. By late afternoon, he'd connected every point, compared the measurements against the original county plat, and printed a preliminary report inside his truck. He handed me the paperwork before climbing back into the driver's seat. "I don't know who built that fence," he said, tapping the survey with one finger, "but I can tell you exactly where it doesn't belong." I looked down at the map. The fence wasn't inches over the line. It wasn't even close. Nearly 4 full feet of my property had been enclosed inside Derek's construction site. I thanked Kyle, walked back into my house, spread the survey across my kitchen table beside the certified plat map, and stared at both documents for several minutes. For the first time since coming home, every doubt disappeared. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. I had proof. And once I had proof, there was only one phone call left to make. The attorney I called that afternoon was named Rachel Monroe, and before I even finished telling the story, she interrupted me with one question that caught me completely off guard. "Have they poured the concrete yet?" I told her they were scheduled to do it later that week. She let out a quiet breath and said, "Good, because once that happens, your neighbor isn't just dealing with a property dispute anymore. He's creating a demolition project." By the following morning, she had drafted a formal cease and desist letter, along with a request for an emergency injunction. The letter couldn't have been any clearer. The survey confirmed the fence sat on my property. The original boundary wall had been removed without permission, and any additional construction extending onto my land would expose Derek to significant legal liability. The paperwork was delivered by certified mail that same afternoon. I honestly believed that would be enough. Maybe he'd cool off, call his contractor, and realize this whole thing had gotten out of hand. Instead, Thursday morning, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of concrete trucks backing into his driveway. I walked outside just in time to see gray concrete pouring into wooden forms that extended right alongside the illegal fence. Derek noticed me standing there and wandered over with a towel slung across his shoulder, looking almost amused. "Got your lawyer's letter," he said before I could speak. "And?" I asked. He shrugged, that same arrogant shrug I'd seen a dozen times already. "My contractor says we're fine." "Based on what?" I asked. "The app." He smiled. "Close enough." I looked past him as another truck emptied its load, wet concrete spreading across ground I legally owned. Then I looked back at him and said, "I hope you enjoy this patio while it lasts." He laughed. "You're taking this way too seriously." I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. Sometimes the loudest response is letting someone keep making their own mistake. Rachel filed the lawsuit the very next morning. Trespassing, property damage, encroachment, destruction of an established boundary structure. 3 weeks later, we found ourselves sitting inside the county courthouse. It wasn't dramatic like television. Nobody slammed fists on tables. Nobody shouted objections every 30 seconds. The room was quiet enough to hear pages turning. Somehow that silence made everything feel even heavier. Derek arrived wearing an expensive suit and carrying the same confidence he'd shown since the day I came home. Rachel organized our documents while I watched him chatting comfortably with his attorney. It honestly looked like he expected to be home before lunch. The judge entered, reviewed the filings. And Rachel presented our case step by step. She showed the certified subdivision plat, the licensed survey, photographs of the demolished stone wall, and invoices documenting every expense. Then came the surveyor's affidavit, confirming the original iron markers had never moved. When Derek's attorney stood up, he did the best he could with what he'd been given. He argued that his client genuinely believed the property line was different based on mapping software, and that the old wall may have been incorrectly placed decades earlier. Then he handed the judge a printed screenshot from the same real estate app Derek had proudly shown me in the backyard. The judge studied both documents in complete silence. First the certified survey, then the phone app, then the survey again. Finally, he adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Derek's attorney. "Counsel," he said calmly, "one of these documents was prepared by a licensed surveyor using permanent subdivision markers recorded with the county." He gently tapped the second page. "The other appears to be a mobile phone application." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom before everyone settled down again. The judge turned toward Derek. "Did you obtain a professional survey before removing the existing boundary wall?" "No, Your Honor," his attorney answered. "Did you seek permission from your neighbor before demolishing that structure?" "No." "Were you notified of the property dispute before the concrete was poured?" Rachel answered that one. "Yes, Your Honor, by certified legal notice." The judge nodded slowly, closed the file in front of him, and folded his hands. Property ownership is determined by legally established surveys and recorded documents, not by consumer mapping software. The room became completely still. The court orders the immediate removal of the fence constructed on the plaintiff's property. Derek lowered his head slightly, but the judge continued. "The concrete patio encroaching onto the plaintiff's property shall be demolished in its entirety and removed." Derek looked up so fast his chair squeaked across the floor. His attorney quietly asked if partial removal would satisfy the order. The judge simply replied, "No, it should never have been built there." Then came the decision that truly ended the argument. The defendant will finance the reconstruction of the original stone boundary wall using comparable materials, reimburse all surveying costs, legal fees, court costs, and any damages resulting from the unauthorized removal of the original structure. One tap of the gavel, and months of arrogance collapsed in less than 10 seconds. Over the next several weeks, I watched the entire project unfold in reverse. First, the wooden fence disappeared. Then workers arrived carrying jackhammers instead of concrete tools. The same patio Derek had proudly shown off was broken apart piece by piece, every deafening crack echoing across the neighborhood. People walking their dogs slowed down to watch. Some shook their heads. Others whispered to each other from across the street. Nobody had much to say to Derek anymore. 2 weeks later, a masonry crew arrived with truckloads of hand-cut fieldstone that looked remarkably close to the originals. For 3 straight days, they rebuilt the wall one stone at a time until it stood exactly where it had stood for decades. When the foreman stepped back to admire the finished work, he smiled and said, "Looks like it's been here forever." I smiled back and answered, "Because it should have been." These days, Derek and I barely acknowledge each other. Sometimes we'll pull into our driveways at the same time, exchange a quick nod, and keep walking. Maybe that's for the best. Not every neighbor ends up becoming a friend, and not every disagreement has a peaceful ending. But every now and then, I think about how different everything could have been if he'd simply knocked on my front door before picking up a demolition hammer. One conversation could have saved him months of stress and tens of thousands of dollars. Instead, pride convinced him that being confident was the same thing as being right, and that turned out to be the most expensive mistake he ever made. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were the judge, would you have made the exact same ruling, or do you think ordering the entire patio torn out went too far? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always divide people. And if you enjoy real-life neighborhood conflicts, courtroom justice, and those unforgettable moments when arrogance finally meets accountability, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who'll definitely have an opinion. Trust me, I'd love to hear where you stand.